Section 1. The catchphrase that changes everything. There is a phrase. You have heard it 100 times if you have watched even a few episodes of Rick and Morty. It is loud, it is nonsensical. It sounds like something a person shouts when they are having the best possible moment of their life. Rick Sanchez fires it off at parties, at the beginning of adventures, in the middle of chaos, during moments that seem to call for pure, unfiltered celebration. It has been printed on t-shirts. It has been turned into memes. It has been searched millions of times on the internet. It has become so embedded in pop culture that people who have never watched a single episode of the show still somehow know what it sounds like when they hear it. The phrase is wubba lubba dub dub. And the reason this particular phrase deserves to be the very first thing we talk about when we start unpacking every theory surrounding Rick Sanchez is that it is, in many ways, the most accurate summary of everything Rick is that the show ever gives you. It sounds joyful. It sounds celebratory. It sounds like a person who has no worries, no scars, nothing weighing him down. It sounds like a man living his absolute best life. And then you learn what it actually means. And after you learn that, nothing about Rick Sanchez ever quite looks the same again. The reveal happens during the first season, in an episode called Rick's Business. Rick is throwing one of his infamous parties at the Smith family house while Beth and Jerry are away. There is chaos everywhere, naturally. There are aliens in the living room. There are things happening in various corners of the house that nobody wants to look at too closely. Rick is in his element, holding court, being exactly the version of himself that he presents to the world when he wants to seem most invulnerable. Loud, dismissive, larger than life, apparently delighted by everything around him. He is performing contentment so convincingly that anyone watching him would assume that this is a person who has everything figured out. And at some point in the middle of all this noise and chaos, Birdperson, one of Rick's oldest and closest friends, ends up having a quiet conversation with Morty. Morty asks Birdperson what wubba lubba dub dub means, because even Morty, who lives with Rick, who has been dragged across the universe with Rick, who knows Rick better than almost anyone alive, has always assumed it was just a silly thing Rick says. Just noise. Just Rick being Rick. The same way someone might assume that any frequently repeated word from someone's vocabulary is just verbal habit, just something the mouth does when nothing more specific is required. Birdperson looks at Morty with the kind of quiet, steady expression that people wear when they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. He has the bearing of someone who has known Rick for a very long time, through things that are hard to describe and harder to forget, and who understands that Rick is not always saying what he appears to be saying. He tells Morty that in his people's native language, that phrase, that ridiculous-sounding party chant that Rick deploys constantly, translates to something specific, something that has nothing to do with celebration or joy or the kind of careless freedom that Rick performs so convincingly. In Birdperson's language, wubba lubba dub dub means this: I am in great pain, please help me. Take a moment with that. Really let it settle in. Rick Sanchez, the character who appears in nearly every scene as the most untouchable, most self-sufficient, most emotionally armored person in any room he walks into, has been walking around since the very beginning of the show broadcasting his own suffering in plain sight. Every time he shouts that phrase in celebration, he is, in the language of his closest friend, screaming for help. Every party, every victory lap, every moment where he seems most alive and most in control is also, if you can read it, a moment where he is drowning. He is right there on the surface, visible to anyone who speaks the right language, and nobody does. Or nobody lets on that they do. Morty's response when Birdperson tells him this is exactly what you would expect from a 14-year-old boy who would rather believe the comfortable version of things than the true one. He says that Rick is obviously saying it ironically. Of course it is ironic. Rick is always ironic. Everything Rick does has layers of deflection wrapped around it. Saying the phrase is probably just another layer of deflection. That is what Morty tells himself, and it is the most perfectly Morty thing he could possibly say. Because of course Morty would rather believe that than sit with what it actually means about the person he looks up to. And maybe Morty is partially right. Maybe Rick does say it ironically, at least on some level. Maybe he knows exactly what it translates to, and he chooses it specifically because he can hide inside the joke. He can be in tremendous pain, and nobody will ever know, because they will all just laugh at the silly catchphrase and move on. That is precisely the kind of move Rick is brilliant at. taking something real, something painful, something that would make him vulnerable if expressed directly, and putting it inside something so absurd that nobody looks past the absurdity to the thing underneath. But here's the complication with the irony defense. The reason irony works as emotional armor is that the person behind the joke can always retreat into the joke whenever things get too real. I was not being serious. It was just a bit. You are reading too much into it. Rick has built his entire emotional architecture around exactly this kind of retreat. He wraps his genuine feelings in layers of sarcasm and absurdity and sheer theatrical confidence so thick that most people never look beyond the surface. And the people who do look, like Birdperson, and eventually Dr. Wong, and in his own way, Morty, tend to find something underneath that Rick is working very hard to keep hidden. The fact that this particular phrase, the most iconic thing Rick Sanchez has ever said, means what it means in Birdperson's language, is not a throwaway joke written by tired writers who needed to fill a moment. The writers of Rick and Morty are meticulous about layering meaning into things that look surface level. They chose that translation deliberately. They were giving you the entire show in 12 syllables. They were telling you that the character you are going to spend years watching is someone who is suffering enormously, who cannot or will not ask for help in any direct way, and who has chosen to perform joy so convincingly that the performance itself becomes the most effective mask he has ever built. Think about the mechanics of what is happening. Rick did not invent the phrase from nothing. He borrowed it, presumably from deep exposure to Birdperson's culture at some point during their long shared history. They fought together. They survived things together. Rick spent enough time in Birdperson's world to pick up language from it. And at some point Rick heard this phrase in Birdperson's language, understood its meaning, understood that it meant, "I am in great pain, please help me," and then chose to bring it back into his own daily vocabulary, not as a private code, not as something whispered in moments of genuine crisis, as his catchphrase, his go-to celebration sound, the thing he shouts most enthusiastically at the moments that are supposed to feel the best. He took a cry for help from one world and used it as a party chant in his own. And every time he says it, there is some part of him, however buried, however well defended against acknowledgement, that knows exactly what he is saying. He is performing happiness in the language of suffering. He is saying, "I am fine. Look how fine I am." While simultaneously, in the only language of emotional honesty available to him, saying, "I am not fine at all. I have never been fine. I am in enormous pain and I need help, and I do not know how to ask for it in any way that anyone will take seriously." There is a linguistic detail about the phrase that makes this even more layered. Fans who pay close attention to language have pointed out that the phrase uses what linguists call reduplication, specifically in the dub-dub portion. In many real human languages, reduplication, meaning the repetition of a word or a syllable, functions as an intensifier. If dub in Birdperson's language means pain, then dub-dub does not simply mean pain, it means intensified pain. It means the kind of pain that one word cannot adequately capture, the kind that has to be repeated to even gesture toward its full weight. The phrase does not say, "I am in some pain," it says, "I am in great pain." The doubling does actual grammatical work. The suffering being described is not ordinary. It is the kind of suffering that the ordinary word for suffering cannot contain. Then there is the second part. Please help me. Not I notice that I am in pain. Not I observe that my situation is difficult. But please help me. A direct address to a listener, a request, an admission of need. And need, to Rick Sanchez, is among the most dangerous things in the world. Need means vulnerability. Need means that you cannot handle things on your own. Need means that you have reached the edges of what your intelligence and your inventions and your sheer force of will can manage, and you are asking someone else to step in. Rick spends enormous amounts of energy every single day avoiding that admission in every other area of his life. And yet his catchphrase, the thing he says most reflexively and most automatically and most apparently joyfully, is a request for exactly that. Google made this a searchable Easter egg for a period of time. If you typed "wubba lubba dub dub" into Google's search engine, the engine would ask if you meant, "I am in great pain. Please help me." That was Google's response to the search query. The joke went mainstream enough for a technology company to encode it into their search algorithm, which says something about how deeply the revelation landed with the audience when the show first aired. because it is one of those pieces of information that you genuinely cannot unknow once you know it. Every rewatch of the series is different after that moment. Every time Rick shouts it at the end of a successful adventure, every time he fires it off at a party while pretending to be carefree, there is this additional layer of meaning running underneath the visible surface. A second frequency? A secret channel that is broadcasting the opposite of what the first channel is saying. And here is what makes the whole thing even more quietly devastating. Birdperson is one of the very few people who would understand the phrase. He is the person in Rick's life who knows Rick's full history, or as close to it as anyone knows. He has seen Rick at his lowest. He has been the steady presence in Rick's life for decades, the one who showed up consistently in a way that almost nobody else did. And the phrase Rick chose as his public face, the cheerful nonsense he presents to every stranger and every alien and every dimension he passes through, is a phrase in Birdperson's language. A language that only Birdperson among Rick's current acquaintances would understand. Is that an accident? Is it possible that Rick, even unconsciously, chose to embed his distress signal in the one language that the one person he trusts most would recognize? That his cry for help is directed at the person he most trusts to receive it, but encoded in a party chant so that nobody else is forced to see his vulnerability, and so that even Birdperson can choose to let it go if that is what the moment requires. The more you think about it, the more it reads like something very precisely designed. The catchphrase is not random. It is a very specific choice made by someone who understood exactly what he was choosing, even if he would never in 1,000 years admit to understanding it. This is where every theory about Rick Sanchez begins. Not with the portal gun, not with the intelligence, not with the nihilism or the drinking or the genius or the grief. It begins with the phrase that sounds like celebration and means something else entirely. It begins with the recognition that this person has been telling us who he is from the very beginning, in a language most people do not speak, and everything we are going to explore tonight, every theory and every layer and every hidden corner of who Rick Sanchez actually is underneath the performance, is an attempt to learn that language well enough to hear what he has been saying all along. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are and what time it is. I love knowing where these videos reach. And if this kind of slow, quiet, late-night deep dive is your thing, the subscribe button is right there. It costs nothing and it means everything. Number section 2. The origin story Diane, Rick Prime, and the bomb that made a monster. Every story about who a person is right now eventually leads back to a moment that cracked them open. For Rick Sanchez, that moment is not complicated once the show finally stops hiding it. It is a bomb. It is a body in a house. It is another version of Rick, one who made different choices and has become something colder and more deliberate because of those choices, standing at the origin point of everything and deciding to destroy it. Let us go back to the very beginning, not the beginning of the show, but the beginning of the story that made the show possible. Rick Sanchez, in the version of his past that the series eventually confirms as real and not fabricated, was once something that seems almost impossible to reconcile with who he becomes. He was content, not performed contentment, not the elaborate performance of someone who has decided that satisfaction is the best armor against further disappointment. Real, quiet, ordinary contentment of the kind that most people spend their whole lives chasing, and some lucky few actually find. He had a wife named Diane. He had a daughter named Beth. He was working on teleportation technology in a home lab somewhere, which tells you that the genius was always present, that the drive to understand and build was always part of him, but it was pointed towards something constructive rather than compulsive. He had a life that had the particular warmth of something chosen and tended. And then another Rick showed up at his door. This other Rick, who the series eventually names Rick Prime, had already done what Rick C-137 was still working on. He had cracked interdimensional travel. He had the portal gun. He had stood on the other side of the barriers between dimensions and seen what was waiting there and made a choice about what to do with that knowledge. And the choice he made was not to go home and share the discovery with his family and build something collaborative and expansive. The choice he made was to go dimension to dimension, visiting other versions of himself, trying to recruit them into whatever he was building out in the infinite multiverse. He wanted fellow travelers. He wanted more Ricks who had made the same choice he had made, which was the choice to leave. He offered Rick C-137 the full package. Come with me. See everything the universe has to offer. Leave behind the small domestic arrangement you have built here. All the things you could be doing, all the places you could go, all the questions you could answer, all of that is right there waiting for you on the other side of a portal. All you have to do is choose it over this, over the house, over Diane, over Beth, who is still a child, who will barely remember you in 20 years if you go. Rick C. 137 said no. This is the hinge of the entire story. This is the moment that every subsequent thing follows from. Rick Prime had the same brain, the same intelligence, the same access to the same intellectual gifts that Rick C. 137 had. They were, in some meaningful sense, the same person. They had made the same choices up to a certain point and then diverged. Rick Prime looked at everything he had, everything Rick C. 137 still had, and he saw something expendable. Rick C. 137 looked at exactly the same thing and saw something worth staying for. In that choice, before any of the tragedy, before any of the damage that defines the Rick we know, there is this man choosing love over infinity, choosing a person over a universe of possibilities, saying no to everything that his intelligence could access in exchange for the simple and non-genius act of remaining present with the people he loved. Rick Prime did not take the refusal with grace. He did not accept it as a difference in values, shrug, and continue his journey. What he did instead is the act that defines the entire mythology of the show. He planted a bomb. He found Rick C. 137's house, and he killed Diane. He killed the version of Beth that existed in Dimension C. 137, and then he left, presumably continuing his interdimensional recruitment drive, adding this casualty to whatever cost-benefit analysis he was running internally, and finding it acceptable. Whether this was done out of pure spite for being refused, or out of a desire to eliminate what he saw as a weakness in another version of himself, or out of some colder strategic logic that the show has not yet fully exposed, the effect was the same regardless of the motive. Rick C. 137 came back to a house that no longer had the people who had made it a home. The specific mechanics of how that moment must have felt are worth dwelling on, even though the show does not dwell on them. Rick C. 137 was a man who had just said no to the entire universe. He had chosen ordinary life over extraordinary freedom and done it willingly, with full knowledge of what he was turning down. He had made the active decision that what he had at home was worth more than everything waiting out there, and the universe, as represented by another version of himself, responded to that choice by destroying what he had chosen. The cruelty of the timing is almost perfect in its devastation. He had just demonstrated what mattered most to him, and then the thing that mattered most to him was gone. The grief that follows is not the grief of someone who loses something without warning. It is the grief of someone who loses something in direct response to having acknowledged how much they valued it. That is a different and more corrosive kind of loss. It carries guilt and anger alongside the sadness, because you cannot help but trace the line from your own choice to the outcome. Rick did not cause the deaths of Diane and Beth. Rick Prime did. But the grief brain, which does not observe logical causation very carefully, will not leave alone the fact that if Rick had said yes to Rick Prime, if he had agreed to leave and been gone when the bomb went off, Diane and Beth might still have been alive. The logic is wrong, the guilt is irrational, but grief is not a rational process, and irrational guilt is one of its most persistent features. In the years that followed, Rick did what people sometimes do when the grief is too big to feel directly. He turned it into action. He built his own portal gun, driven by the singular need to find the person who had done this. He went dimension to dimension, not exploring with curiosity and joy the way Rick Prime was doing, but hunting. Searching for Rick Prime through the infinite multiverse, which is the universe's most hostile environment for a search because infinity means there is always another dimension to check, another possibility to rule out, another version of events to investigate. He was relentless during this period, and he was effective in the ways that Rick is always effective, which is to say that his intelligence was pointed at destruction, and destruction happened. He killed a significant number of other Ricks who had been connected to Rick Prime's early organization during this hunt. He was not precisely discriminating about who deserved what, but he could not find Rick Prime. The multiverse is genuinely infinite. Rick Prime is genuinely intelligent and genuinely resourceful. And at some point, even the most driven person has to reckon with the possibility that the thing they are chasing cannot be caught by the methods they are currently using. Rick eventually stopped actively hunting and started doing something else with the time and intelligence he had previously devoted to revenge. He helped build the Central Finite Curve, which we will discuss in much more depth in a later section, and which is its own entire layer of Rick's psychology and history. And he found a family. Not his family. A family from the dimension that Rick Prime had originally come from and then abandoned. A Beth who had grown up without a father and a Morty who did not yet exist in the way he would eventually exist. Rick C-137 crashed into their lives, built a lab in their garage, and began the complicated, never entirely resolved project of being present for people who were not originally his but who needed what he could, at his best, provide. He never processed what happened to Diane. The evidence for this is everywhere in the show if you know how to read it, but the most specific and devastating piece of evidence is that he built an AI version of her. At his old house in Dimension C-137, the dimension where she and Beth died, Rick constructed a simulation of Diane. A program sophisticated enough to call to him from another room, to sound like her, to maintain the presence of someone who was not there in any real sense, in a dimension that Rick had frozen at the moment of maximum loss. He kept that dimension in a time loop, the day repeating over and over, the wound never allowed to close. The inhabitants of that dimension trapped in the same moment forever, all so that Rick could come back, if he needed to the exact point where everything became unbearable. This is not the behavior of someone who is moving forward. This is the behavior of someone who has built a shrine to their own pain and visits it when the world outside becomes too comfortable. When he finally releases the time loop, in a later season, as part of a reckoning with his own patterns, the show frames it as a genuinely difficult thing he is doing, not a small practical matter, a genuine emotional cost. And then there is the Omega device. Rick Prime, at some point after killing Diane in C-137, acquired a weapon of incomprehensible cruelty and used it on the concept of Diane Sanchez herself. The Omega device erased Diane across the entirety of the multiverse, not just in one dimension, not just in the dimensions that Rick Prime had access to, across all of it. Every single version of Diane that had ever existed in any configuration of reality ceased to exist. Rick C-137 could not, after this, travel to another dimension and find a Diane. He could not meet a version of her who had lived a different life. He could not have any version of the conversation that was stolen from him in Dimension C-137. The loss was made total, made permanent, made as absolute as loss can be in a universe that is supposed to contain every possibility. Rick Prime had figured out how to eliminate a possibility from infinity, and he used that capability on the one thing that Rick C-137 needed most to have survived somewhere. This is the wound. Not just the loss, because loss is something people carry all the time, and people who are very good at carrying things can manage loss. But the specificity of this loss, the deliberateness of it, the fact that it was done by a version of Rick himself, which means that somewhere in Rick's understanding of who he is, he has to know that the capacity for this kind of cruelty was available to him too. He chose differently than Rick Prime did, but he had access to the same choice. He is made of the same stuff. And that particular knowledge is something that does not ever quite go away, no matter how many dimensions you travel to, or how many drinks you have, or how many adventures you use to avoid looking at it directly. When Rick finally kills Rick Prime, in the Season 7 episode Unmortricken, it is not a triumphant moment. The show has too much emotional intelligence to play it as one. Rick beats Rick Prime to death with his bare hands, which is itself significant. All of Rick's tools, all of his inventions, all of the weapons and technologies he has built over decades, and when the moment finally comes, he does it with his hands. He does it personally. He does it in a way that requires him to be present for every second of it, rather than delegating it to technology. And when it is over, he is not better. He does not feel the release that he has been waiting decades to feel. The grief is still there. The wound is still there. Because the wound was never really about Rick Prime. Rick Prime was the name he gave to his grief, so that the grief had a target. Eliminate the target and you still have the grief. You still have the loss. You still have the Diane-shaped absence that nothing in the infinite multiverse can fill, because Rick Prime already made sure of that. What Rick has to face after killing Rick Prime is the most difficult thing any human being faces, which is a grief that has no more external object to be directed at, just the grief itself. Just the loss, bare and unmediated, without even the comfort of having someone to blame and the project of hunting them down. Just a man, standing in the ruins of the revenge he thought would fix things, realizing that the thing that needed to be fixed was never something that could be fixed from the outside. Section 3. Rick C. 137. The Stranger in Someone Else's Home. One of the most quietly profound complications in Rick and Morty's lore is a piece of information that the show teased for years before finally confirming it explicitly. The Morty we follow throughout the series is not from Dimension C-137. He is from what the show calls the Prime Dimension, which eventually becomes the Cronenberg dimension after the catastrophic events of Rick Potion number 9 in the first season. And Rick C-137, our Rick, is from a completely different dimension than the one the show is primarily set in. He crashed into a family that was not originally his. He moved into a house that belonged to other people, and he has been building a life inside a family that, in the most fundamental possible sense, began without him. This matters more than it might initially appear to, because it means that every warm moment between Rick and Morty, every sacrifice Rick makes for the Smith family, every instance of genuine connection that the show gives us between this man and these specific people, is happening between someone who arrived from outside and people who were here first. Rick does not belong here in the way that characters on most family shows belong in their settings. He chose this. Or he was drawn here by circumstances related to the hunt for Rick Prime. Or both. He had reasons for being here, and not all of those reasons were purely about love. And yet love, or something that functions like love and perhaps is love despite its complicated origins, is clearly part of what has developed. The moment in Rick Potion number 9 that the whole fan community knows about establishes, as a kind of dark comedy, the mechanical process by which Rick handles catastrophic dimensional failure. He and Morty travel to a dimension where their counterparts have just died. They dig up the graves, they bury the bodies, they step into those dead men's shoes and resume living their lives as if nothing happened. Rick executes this with such practiced efficiency that it communicates clearly. This is not the first time he has done this. He knows the procedure. He knows where to get the shovels and how to dress the scene, and how to restart in a new dimension without leaving obvious traces of the transition. He has done this before, in other dimensions, in other catastrophes, moving through crises by simply relocating into the nearest available version of his own life. This raises the question that fans identified very early. If the Rick we know has done this multiple times, how many Ricks came before him in the position he currently occupies? How many versions of this family has he moved through? Is the relationship he has with this Morty the first one that has mattered to him? Or is there a lineage of Mortys behind this one, all of them loved and then left behind when dimensions collapsed, or worse things happened and the solution was relocation? The show seems to suggest, through the emotional depth of Rick's bond with the current Morty, that this particular relationship is distinct. That something about this specific Morty, the Mortiest Morty as Rick once called him, has gotten through to Rick in a way that previous relationships might not have. Morty Prime has a quality to him, a particular combination of anxiety and decency and persistence, that Rick does not seem able to dismiss in the way he dismisses most things. He keeps coming back to this kid. He keeps making choices that put Morty's well-being above his own convenience, which is not something he does easily or naturally. Something about this particular version of the relationship has stuck. But the question of whether Rick distinguishes clearly between Morty as an individual and Morty as a category is one that the show deliberately leaves unresolved. Rick was involved in the creation of the Citadel of Ricks, where Mortys are literally mass-produced as accessories for Ricks. There are infinite Mortys. Rick knows there are infinite Mortys. He has been around the multiverse enough to understand that the specific individual he calls Morty is one instance of a type that exists in countless forms. Does he love the individual? Does he love what a Morty represents to him, which might include lost things from his own past? Does he love the relationship itself rather than the specific person in it? The show is wise enough not to fully answer this, because the answer is probably yes to all three in proportions that shift depending on the episode and the moment. What is clearer is the question of Beth. Rick's relationship with his daughter Beth is the most emotionally complicated thing in the show, more so even than his relationship with Morty, because it carries so much more history. The Beth in the Smith household is not Rick's original Beth. His original Beth was killed in Dimension C-137 when she was a child by the same bomb that killed Diane. This Beth grew up in a world where Rick was absent, where Rick abandoned her, where she spent her whole life with a father-shaped hole in the middle of her family and a complicated grief about what that meant for who she became. She is not the daughter he lost, and yet she is a version of that daughter, a different path the same person could have taken. Rick's relationship with her carries grief that she does not know about and could not fully understand. Every time he looks at her, on some level, he is looking at the version of a person he failed to protect. Every act of care he extends to this Beth is, in some hidden register, an attempt to do for this version what he could not do for the one he originally had. That does not make his love for this Beth false. The love is clearly real, and the show gives us ample evidence of it. But it is also love that is shaped by loss, filtered through absence, tinted by the specific knowledge of what a Beth without a father becomes and what that costs her. The fact that Rick ended up in the Prime dimension, partly because he was hoping Rick Prime would eventually return there, which was confirmed in later seasons, means that his initial arrival was not purely emotional. He had a strategic reason for choosing this specific family to land with, rather than any of the infinite other families available to him. He was using them, or at least using the circumstances they represented, as bait for the thing he most wanted to catch. And somewhere along the way, the bait turned into something real. The people he was using as a trap for Rick Prime became people he could not imagine abandoning. The original calculation got complicated by something that does not submit to calculation. This is the specific shape of Rick's emotional life. He arrives at things sideways. He comes to care about people through back doors and side streets. He ends up attached to things that he originally approached with instrumental logic. And then he is stuck because caring is dangerous, and he knows it is dangerous, and he chose it anyway. And now the defenses he needs to build to protect the caring are in direct conflict with the defenses he already has that protect him from admitting he cares. He never fully belongs. Not in the Smith household. Not in any household. He is constitutionally a visitor everywhere he goes. A man who could leave at any moment and who is choosing not to leave, and who knows that the choice not to leave is itself a form of vulnerability that could be used against him. He showed up in the Prime dimension as a strategic decision and stayed as an emotional one, and neither of those facts resolves the other. Both of them are true simultaneously. That simultaneous truth is what makes Rick such a rich character to theorize about. He is never just one thing. He is not purely a broken man using this family as a substitute for the one he lost. He is not purely a strategic actor using these people for his own purposes. He is not purely a person who loves them in an uncomplicated way. He is all of those things at once, in proportions that the show has spent many seasons slowly adjusting, and the adjustment has been consistently moving him toward the version where the love is real and acknowledged, even if the acknowledgement comes in the indirect language of a man who does not know how to speak love directly. Number. Section 4. The Flask, the Drool, and the Mega Seeds. One of the most persistent and quietly fascinating fan theories in the Rick and Morty community is also one of the most destabilizing, because if it is true, it undermines something that the whole show takes as a fundamental given. The theory is that Rick Sanchez's intelligence is not natural, not innate, not something he was born with or developed through decades of genuine scientific effort and natural brilliance. It is something he maintains through chemical supplementation, specifically through a substance derived from the megaseeds that appear in the very first episode of the show. Let us walk through the evidence slowly, because the evidence is actually quite compelling once you look at it all together. In the pilot episode, Rick takes Morty on a mission to Dimension 35C specifically to retrieve megaseeds. The mission requires Morty to transport the seeds through his body in a way that the show renders as undignified by design, because the indignity is part of Rick's strategy. He needs the seeds to pass through interdimensional customs without detection, and Morty provides that cover in an uncomfortable way. Rick gives Morty the instructions and sends him through. During the crossing, the seeds absorb into Morty's system, and something remarkable happens. Morty becomes significantly more intelligent, not slightly more confident or articulate, actually measurably more intelligent in the technical sense. He can calculate complex mathematics from memory. He understands and can quote the first law of thermodynamics. He is sharp, quick, coherent in ways that are clearly beyond his normal baseline. Rick himself comments on this. The megaseeds, when they are active in someone's system, confer genuine cognitive enhancement. Then the effect begins to wear off. And as it does, two things happen in close succession. First, Morty's enhanced cognition collapses, relatively quickly, back to whatever his ordinary baseline is. Second, he starts to drool. A particular kind of liquid, described as drool, begins to appear around Morty's mouth as the cognitive enhancement fades. And Morty, for a period after this, is actually below his normal cognitive baseline, stumbling around in a kind of post-enhancement fog as the seeds fully leave his system. The drool is the detail that fans seized on, because the drool, this liquid that appears at the corner of Morty's mouth as the mega seeds wear off, looks exactly like the stuff that Rick has around his mouth pretty much constantly throughout the entire series. Rick almost always has some liquid at the corner of his mouth or on his chin. It has been widely read as a visual shorthand for his alcoholism, and certainly that reading is supported by the show's explicit treatment of his drinking. But fans notice that the liquid is not always the color of alcohol. It can be greenish. It has a specific look that matches the drool that Morty produces post-seed exposure. The fan theory that emerged from this is as follows. Rick is not simply an alcoholic. The flask he drinks from so compulsively throughout every episode does not contain only alcohol. It contains some form of mega seed extract, a processed or diluted version of the seeds that Rick has figured out how to make drinkable and continuous rather than intermittent. He maintains his intelligence through regular, constant doses of this substance. The drool is not just the mark of his drinking. It is the same cognitive withdrawal symptom that Morty displays when the seeds wear off, managed by Rick through constant topping up rather than allowed to progress to the stumbling post-fog stage. If this is true, the implications are significant and far-reaching. It would mean that the intelligence the entire show is built on, the thing that allows Rick to build portal guns and defeat galactic federations and consistently outthink every opponent and adversary he ever faces, is not something he simply has. It is something he has to work to maintain, something he has to dose himself with continuously to preserve. The greatest genius in the known universe would not be an effortless natural superior. He would be a man who has found a chemical substrate for his capabilities and who depends on that substrate to remain capable of being who he presents himself as. The implications for his relationship with his flask become darker and more interesting in this reading. When Rick drinks, he is not simply managing an alcohol addiction, though he may also be doing that. He is maintaining his identity. He is performing the biochemical work necessary to remain Rick Sanchez rather than whatever lower capability version of himself would exist without the supplementation. The flask is not just a habit. It is a life support system for his sense of self. This also reframes the drool in a completely different way. The drool is not just a visual gag about an old man who drinks too much. The drool is evidence of an ongoing biochemical process. It is the marker of someone who is continuously processing the substance that keeps their intelligence where they need it to be. Rick drools throughout the show in the same way that a person running on a particular medication might have a specific set of side effects that are always present as long as the medication is active. The co-creators of the show have been deliberately and consistently evasive about what is in the flask. Early responses to direct questions about it ranged from, "It is just good liquor," to the more suggestive, "We are not ready to discuss that yet." That second answer, given in a Reddit AMA, is the one the fan community found most intriguing. Why would the contents of a flask be something you are not ready to discuss? Why would that require timing and intentionality? Unless the contents of the flask are something that would, if confirmed, change how the audience understands the show in some meaningful way. If it were just alcohol, there would be nothing to withhold and nothing to time. The withholding implies that there is something to withhold. The megaseeds appear again, briefly, in a third season episode, in the context of an entire farm. Just enough of an appearance to remind the audience that they still exist in the world of the show. Just enough of a callback to keep the theory viable without resolving it. The show is very good at this. It will not tell you the answer, but it will keep showing you the evidence and letting you sit with the implications. What this theory does to Rick's character is give his vulnerability a different texture. He is not just emotionally vulnerable in the ways we have discussed. He might be cognitively vulnerable. He might be someone whose greatest weapon, his intelligence, is something he cannot take for granted. Someone who has to tend it, maintain it, keep it fueled. The image of Rick as effortlessly superior to everyone around him is complicated by the image of Rick needing his flask the way a person with a chronic condition needs their medication. He is still brilliant. But the brilliance requires maintenance. And the maintenance is something he handles every single day, quietly, without drawing attention to what he is doing or why. Number. Section 5. Rick knows he is a cartoon. This particular theory occupies a different category than the others, because the show itself has taken a deliberately inconsistent position on it over many seasons. But the evidence for it is scattered across enough episodes, in enough specific forms, that it has become one of the more compelling lenses through which to understand Rick Sanchez and the very specific quality of his relationship with meaning and reality. The theory is that Rick is aware, at some functional level, that he exists within a constructed narrative, that he is a character in a television show, that the universe he inhabits, for all its apparent infinite scale, is shaped and observed and subject to forces that operate outside of his control and outside of the frame of what his universe understands as reality. And that this awareness, whether it manifests as literal knowledge of the television show or as something more abstract and philosophical, is part of what makes him impossible to satisfy and impossible to fully reach. The evidence the show provides is substantial. Rick regularly breaks what is called the fourth wall. He references events from previous episodes in a way that implies he is aware of episode structure as a concept. He comments on story beats as they are happening. He has at various points directly addressed the audience watching the show, stepping outside the fiction to speak to the people observing it. He and Morty appeared in person at the Emmy Awards, which is a deeply strange thing for animated fictional characters to do if they have no awareness that they are animated fictional characters. Rick has interrupted moments in the show where other characters attempt to establish his backstory or pin down some canonical element of his past, apparently resistant to the idea of his own life being fixed into a specific narrative shape. His fourth wall awareness is described in fan wikis and in the show's own supplementary materials as a genuine attribute of his character, likely a consequence of his extraordinary intelligence, giving him a form of meta-perception that other characters do not have. He can see patterns that less perceptive beings miss. He can recognize structure in things that others experience as random. And a universe that is actually a narrative has structure that, if you are smart enough, begins to become visible. The theory suggests that Rick's nihilism, which we will examine in much more depth in the following section, is not simply a philosophical position that emerged organically from his grief and his enormous intelligence and his long experience with a cold universe. It is the specific, particular nihilism of someone who understands that their reality is authored. Because if Rick knows that he is a character, then he knows that everything in his world is a design decision made by someone outside of it. The stakes are managed. The deaths are narrative choices. The relationships are built for purposes that have nothing to do with their own intrinsic reality, and everything to do with how they function within the story being told. The multiverse that Rick navigates, with its apparent infinite possibilities, would actually be finite in the most absolute sense, constrained by the imaginations and intentions of the writers in the room. For someone of Rick's intelligence and pride, this would be the most intolerable possible condition. He is a man who insists on being the author of his own experience. He insists on being the cleverest person in any situation, the one who is running things, the one whose actions shape what happens rather than the one things happen to. If he suspects that the universe is authored by someone outside of it, then his compulsive need to be in control, to impose his will on every situation, to never simply let things unfold without his fingerprints on them, is actually a form of resistance, a rebellion against narrative determinism. He is trying to be the writer of his own story inside a story that already has writers. This connects to the way Rick handles his own backstory. He is deeply uncomfortable with canonical explanations of who he is and where he came from. When the show provides flashbacks to his past, they are almost always presented with some layer of uncertainty, some reason to question whether what we are seeing is accurate rather than constructed. Rick himself, in the Season 3 premiere, fabricates an entire false backstory so convincing that it passes as his real origin for several minutes of screen time, then reveals it was all built to smuggle a virus into the Federation's systems. He is so comfortable with constructed false backstory that he builds one inside an already constructed narrative without appearing to find anything unusual about that. If Rick knows he is in a story, then his discomfort with fixed backstory is completely understandable and completely consistent. A fixed backstory is a set of constraints. It is the narrative pinning you to specific facts, specific limitations, a specific identity that then constrains everything you can do going forward. Rick does not accept constraints. He refuses constraints from the Galactic Federation, from the Council of Ricks, from his own family, from gravity when it suits him to refuse it. Why would he accept constraints from canon? Why would he be comfortable with a fixed version of his own origins when every other fixed thing in his universe he has been committed to keeping fluid? There is a softer version of this theory that does not require Rick to literally know he is animated and written by humans in a room. This version suggests only that Rick has developed something like narrative awareness through his extreme intelligence and his exposure to infinite dimensional variations of the same story. He has seen enough versions of the same patterns to understand how narratives work from the inside. He can feel when things are being set up. He can recognize foreshadowing when he is inside it. He can tell when a situation is being shaped by forces that have nothing to do with the local causality of the scene he is in. And this kind of meta-awareness, even if it does not resolve into explicit knowledge of being fictional, would produce exactly the kind of dissatisfaction and restlessness and resistance to meaning that characterizes Rick throughout the show. A man who can see the structure of stories would be a man who can never simply inhabit a story. He would always be slightly outside of his own experience, observing it from a meta level, unable to be fully present in any moment because some part of him is always watching the moment from outside it. This would be profoundly lonely in a way that would be very difficult to explain to anyone who did not have the same capacity, and it would make his nihilism not just a coping mechanism but a kind of accurate perception. If meaning is something narratives create rather than something reality contains, then a person who can see the narrative structure sees through the meaning. And seeing through meaning is its own particular kind of suffering. Number. Section 6. The nihilism question: does Rick actually believe nothing matters? Rick Sanchez says, frequently and with apparent conviction, that nothing matters. He says it in many different ways across many different episodes and many different registers of sincerity. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody is going to die. He says these things to his teenage grandson. He builds a personal philosophy around them. He uses them to justify behavior that would otherwise require justification. He presents nihilism as the natural conclusion reached by any sufficiently intelligent being who has looked honestly at the universe and understood what they are seeing. But here is the problem. If you stop listening to what Rick says and start watching what Rick does, the picture that emerges is almost the exact opposite of nihilism. And the gap between what Rick says and what Rick does is where the most interesting theory about his entire character lies. The first and most obvious piece of evidence is that Rick keeps doing things. This sounds simple, but it is actually philosophically significant. Real nihilism, taken to its logical conclusion, is paralyzing. If nothing has value, if all choices lead to outcomes that are equally meaningless, if the universe is indifferent to human action and outcome, then there is no rational basis for action of any kind. Getting out of bed requires the belief that getting out of bed is, in some sense, better than not getting out of bed. Rick gets out of bed. Rick builds things. Rick forms attachments. Rick fights for survival. Rick spends decades hunting down the person who murdered his wife. These are not the actions of someone who genuinely believes nothing matters. They are the actions of someone who cares enormously, but has decided that acknowledging how much they care is too dangerous. Rick dies for Morty. Not once. Multiple times across multiple episodes, he puts himself between Morty and harm in ways that are not explained by self-interest. In a universe of infinite Mortys, a true nihilist would not prioritize the survival of one specific Morty. The loss of one instance of a type that exists in infinite copies should register as zero in a sufficiently nihilistic calculus. Rick does not behave as though it registers as zero. He behaves as though the loss of this particular Morty would be something he could not simply replace and move on from. He sacrifices his oxygen collar for Morty in a situation where there is no backup plan, and doing so is genuinely potentially fatal for Rick himself. There is no nihilism in that moment. There is only the specific weight of a specific relationship. He maintains his friendship with Birdperson across decades despite Birdperson being one of the only people who ever pushes back on Rick honestly and directly. Birdperson does not flatter Rick. He does not pretend that Rick's behavior is acceptable or that his self-destruction is admirable. He speaks to Rick with the calm directness of someone who sees him clearly and likes him anyway, which is a combination that Rick finds genuinely disarming. A real nihilist, someone who genuinely believed that relationships were meaningless and ultimately arbitrary, would not bother with the social and emotional effort of maintaining a friendship with someone who makes demands on you. The easier path is always to find people who want nothing from you. Rick keeps Birdperson in his life. That is a choice. And choices reveal values, regardless of what the person making them says about believing in nothing. The fan community has assembled, over many seasons, a substantial catalog of moments when Rick's nihilism fails to predict his actual behavior. He saves the world on multiple occasions when saving the world is not strictly in his self-interest. He forgoes escape routes that would cost Morty something. He builds things for people he cares about that have no strategic value and no personal reward. He cries. In the moments when his performance falters completely and he cries, there is nothing in the world of genuine nihilism that could explain the tears. Tears require caring about something enough for its presence or absence to produce a physical, emotional response. Rick cries. Therefore, Rick cares. The philosophy does not survive the tears. The most precise articulation of what Rick's nihilism actually is, as opposed to what it claims to be, comes from Dr. Wong in the Pickle Rick episode. She tells Rick, in the compact language of a therapist who has seen this pattern before, that his genius allows him to escape the simple, unglamorous work of actually being a person. That he uses his intelligence to construct reasons to run from the emotional labor of being present in his own life and in his relationships. His nihilism is not wisdom arrived at through careful philosophical reasoning. It is avoidance wearing the costume of wisdom. It is a way of preemptively declaring that nothing matters so that when things are taken from him, or when he chooses to leave things behind, he has already established a framework that says there was nothing to lose. It is the smartest possible emotional defense mechanism. And it has two key features that make it particularly effective. First, it is intellectually defensible. The universe genuinely does not care about human concerns. The scale of the cosmos genuinely dwarfs individual human experience to a degree that makes most of what we worry about appear trivial from sufficient remove. Rick is not wrong that the arguments can be made. Second, it requires no maintenance work. If you believe nothing matters, you do not have to do the hard, unglamorous effort of tending relationships and being honest about your needs and sitting with difficult feelings rather than running from them. The nihilism justifies the avoidance. The avoidance sustains the nihilism. It is a self-reinforcing system, and it is very difficult to interrupt from outside. What makes Rick's relationship with his own nihilism interesting, rather than simply sad, is that he knows. On some level, in the places in himself that he does not allow himself to visit very often, he knows that the philosophy is not accurate. He knows because his behavior keeps contradicting it. He knows because when people he loves are in danger, the part of him that says nothing matters is simply not operative. It does not show up. Some older, more honest part of him takes over, and that part does not believe in nothing. That part believes in them specifically and acts to protect them with a conviction that has nothing philosophical about it. The version of Rick who has been building, slowly and not always consistently, across the later seasons, is a man who is starting to tolerate the knowledge that he cares. Not admitting it publicly, not making speeches about it, but allowing it to exist in himself without immediately burying it in nihilism and sarcasm. That tolerance is harder for him than building a portal gun or defeating a galactic empire. It requires the kind of courage that has nothing to do with the skills the universe has praised him for his whole life. Section 7. The Central Finite Curve and Rick's Greatest Secret. The Central Finite Curve is one of the most structurally important reveals the show has ever made, and it changes the meaning of several things that had previously seemed like straightforward features of the Rick and Morty universe. It changes the meaning of Rick's intelligence. It changes the meaning of his freedom. It changes the meaning of the multiverse itself as the show presents it. And it implicates Rick personally in something that is, depending on how you read it, either one of his most human acts or one of his most arrogant ones, or both simultaneously. Here is what the curve actually is. The Ricks across the multiverse, at some point in the shared history of the Citadel, built a machine. This machine was placed underneath the Citadel of Ricks, and it used an advanced variant of portal gun technology to do something that sounds like it should be impossible. It created a boundary around a subset of the multiverse. On one side of this boundary, inside the Central Finite Curve, exist all and only the dimensions where Rick Sanchez is the dominant life form. All the dimensions where Rick is the smartest being alive, where his intelligence and his technology place him above every other intelligence, every other civilization, every other threat that the universe in those dimensions contains. On the other side of the boundary, outside the curve, is everything else. All the dimensions where someone smarter than Rick exists. All the dimensions where Rick is not automatically on top. All the dimensions where reality has not been curated to guarantee his supremacy. The Ricks who built the curve and who live and operate within it are traveling through an infinity that looks like infinity but is not. They have filtered the multiverse down to a comfortable subset, a carefully selected collection of realities that all share one defining feature, which is that Rick wins. And then they have been operating as though this filtered subset is the whole of what exists, as though their guaranteed supremacy within the curve is evidence that they are naturally superior rather than participants in a system they designed to ensure a specific outcome. Evil Morty's speech before breaking through the curve and escaping it is one of the most powerful pieces of writing the show has ever produced. He articulates, with the calm precision of someone who has understood this for a long time and waited until the right moment to say it out loud, that the Ricks built a prison. They built a wall around the portion of infinity where they are always on top, and then they forgot or chose to forget that they built the wall. They told the Mortys and the Beths and the Jerrys and all the alien species they interacted with that Rick was naturally supreme, that his genius was simply what it was, that the hierarchy was organic rather than engineered. And everyone inside the curve, because they could only see the inside of the curve, had no way to know this was a lie. Now here is where Rick C-137 comes in specifically, because his role in the creation of the curve is more complicated than the role of most of the other Ricks who built it. The evidence in the show, assembled from fragments across multiple seasons, suggests that Rick C-137 helped build the Central Finite Curve partly as a protection mechanism. After Diane and Beth were killed in his dimension, after Rick Prime used the Omega device to erase Diane from the entire multiverse, Rick Prime was traveling through an infinite multiverse, hunting for people to use his devices on or simply for his own reasons. The threat he represented was not contained to any particular corner of the multiverse. He could go anywhere, do anything, reach any version of any person Rick cared about. Building the Central Finite Curve created a contained, closed section of the multiverse. Inside the curve, travel between dimensions could be monitored, regulated, tracked. Rick Prime, who originated from outside the conventional Citadel structure, would have a harder time operating inside the curve without leaving a trail. This made the curve not just a comfort system for Rick's ego, but a practical mechanism for limiting Rick Prime's operational freedom and, potentially, finding him. There is another layer to this. Rick C-137 helped build the machine that ensures all the Ricks within the curve are always the smartest beings in their respective universes. This means that in every dimension inside the curve, there are Beths. Beths who have Rick fathers. Beths who might lose those Rick fathers or might be targeted by Rick Prime, or might be vulnerable in any of the ways that Rick's original Beth was vulnerable. The curve, by creating a closed system with all Ricks inside it, theoretically makes it easier to know where the Beths are, and, perhaps, to protect them. Rick could not protect his original Beth. But inside the curve, the Beths of the multiverse are within a domain where Rick has something approaching oversight. This reading of the curve as a grief-driven protection mechanism does not make it morally simple. The curve also serves Rick's ego. It also serves the collective ego of all the Ricks who built it and benefit from it. It also enables the exploitation of Mortys and the perpetuation of a hierarchy that the Morty population did not consent to and did not benefit from. Rick's possible good motive for helping build it does not undo any of those consequences. Both things are true. He may have had a reason that came from love or something like love, and the thing that reason produced is also a system of control and exploitation. Rick C-137 is not villainous in the way Rick Prime is villainous, but he is also not clean. What Evil Morty does in breaking through the curve is refuse to live inside a reality that was designed specifically to keep him and every other Morty subordinate. He identifies the system for what it is. He acquires the resources and the technology needed to break through the boundary. And he escapes into the part of the multiverse where the rules are different, where Rick is not automatically on top, where a Morty might actually have a chance to be something other than a sidekick in a story whose hero was chosen before the story began. The show does not tell us yet what Evil Morty finds on the other side, but the door is open, and the opening of that door changes the universe of the show permanently. The curve that Rick helped build, with whatever mixture of self-serving and loving motivations he carried at the time, is no longer the impermeable boundary it was designed to be. The infinite multiverse, the real one, is now accessible. And whatever exists out there, in all the dimensions where Rick is not automatically the most important person in the room, is no longer off the table. Section 8. Rick and Therapy Dr. Wong and the Slow Unraveling. There is a version of the Rick and Morty story you could tell exclusively through Rick's relationship with Dr. Helen Wong. It would be a quieter story than the one the show usually tells. There would not be many explosions in it, or alien planets, or dimensional catastrophes. It would mostly be two people sitting in a room, one of them trying to hide from the room and one of them being very patient about the hiding. But it might be the truest version of the story, the one that says the most about what the show is ultimately about. Dr. Wong first appears in the Pickle Rick episode of the 3rd season. The episode is structured, brilliantly, as two simultaneous stories. One of them is an action story in which Rick, who has turned himself into a pickle to avoid attending family therapy, fights his way through a facility full of armed men using nothing but improvised rat-based equipment and his extraordinary problem-solving brain. It is exciting and funny and showcases the part of Rick that the show most often leads with. The other story, which the show keeps cutting back to, is quieter and in some ways harder to watch. It is Beth and Summer and Morty sitting in a waiting room and then sitting across from a therapist and being actually somewhat honest about what their lives are like. When Rick finally arrives at the therapy session, covered in evidence of the action story, he is in the specific position of someone who has just spent enormous energy proving that they do not need the room they are now being forced to enter. He has run an entire elaborate plan to avoid being here. The plan failed in the specific sense that he is here anyway, and now he has to sit across from someone who is looking at him with calm professional attention and absolutely no interest in being impressed by anything he has done in the last several hours. Dr. Wong is not impressed by the pickle thing. She is not impressed by the escape. She is not particularly interested in the action story. She has the settled equanimity of someone who has heard extraordinary things said by ordinary people in extraordinary pain, and she has long since stopped using those extraordinary things as a reason to treat someone differently. She looks at Rick and she sees someone in her office. A patient, a person, and she treats him accordingly. What she says to him in the session is short and precise and correct. She tells Rick that he alternates between viewing his intelligence as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. She tells the whole family that each of them uses intelligence as a justification for not doing the hard, unglamorous, unrewarding work of actually engaging with their own lives and with each other. She tells Rick specifically that he is not exceptional in his avoidance. That avoiding emotional work is extremely common, and his methods are more elaborate than most, but the underlying strategy is something she has seen before. Being a genius does not make a person's self-protective patterns more sophisticated in a way that exempts them from the consequences of those patterns. It just makes the patterns more expensive and more impressive to observe from the outside. The specific line she delivers that cuts deepest, the one that the fan community has returned to again and again, is that Rick uses his intelligence to construct scenarios in which he must be clever and inventive, specifically to avoid scenarios in which he must be emotionally honest. He turned himself into a pickle rather than attend therapy. The pickle thing was not random. It was not simply Rick being Rick. It was the most efficient solution to the problem of having to sit in a room and be known by someone. The pickle was armor, like everything else Rick has ever built, just organic this time. And here is the thing. Rick does not have a counter-argument. In a show where Rick almost always has a counter-argument, where he can dismember the logic of almost any position put to him in about 30 seconds, when Dr. Wong is done speaking, he is quiet. He processes what she has said. He does not dismiss it. He does not perform dismissal, which is different. He sits with it for a moment, and then he gets up and leaves without paying, which is itself a form of acknowledgement. If nothing she had said was real, he would not need to avoid paying. The not paying is a way of making the session not count without doing the work of arguing that nothing she said was true. He goes back. That is the most important sentence in this section, and it deserves to sit alone. He goes back to Dr. Wong. Not in the very next episode, not in the next season, but eventually, and then again, and then again. She becomes a recurring presence in his life across multiple seasons in a way that is understated and almost incidental in its presentation, but which is actually one of the most significant arcs in the show when you trace it across time. Each time Rick returns to her office, something has shifted slightly. Each time they talk, something gets slightly further through. By the later seasons, there are moments in which Rick actually consults Dr. Wong, not because circumstances have forced him into her presence, but because he has decided that her perspective is useful to him. He seeks out the conversation. He initiates the contact. A man who turned himself into a pickle to avoid being in a room with her is now choosing to be in a room with her. The show is careful not to make this into a transformation arc that is too clean or too linear. Rick backtracks. He has sessions that seem to produce real movement, followed by episodes where he is exactly the same defensive person he has always been. He makes progress and then retreats from the progress. He allows things through and then builds them back out. This is how actual therapeutic work goes for actual people, and it is a sign of the show's emotional intelligence that it does not collapse the process into a simple before and after. Rick is not fixed, but he is moving. Slowly, inconsistently, with enormous resistance and enormous backsliding, but moving. By season 6, Rick takes Dr. Wong's advice in a situation where his old approach would have been to escalate and retaliate. He asks for her perspective. He receives it. He uses it. The version of Rick who asks for and follows advice from another human being is categorically different from the version of Rick who arrived in the first season performing invincibility. That version would have considered asking for advice a kind of death. This version treats it as a tool, which is progress, because tools are things Rick trusts and uses and values. The neurodivergence mentioned in a later season, in which it is obliquely confirmed that Rick has some form of neurodivergence, possibly autism or ADHD, or a combination that defies easy categorization, adds another layer to the therapy trajectory. Rick's patterns of rigidity, his difficulty with emotional regulation, his extreme focus capacities combined with his difficulty sustaining ordinary social engagement, these are not just characterization choices. They are aspects of how his brain is built, layered on top of everything else he is carrying. Therapy with someone who understands this, who can meet his brain where it actually is rather than where neurotypical therapeutic frameworks assume it should be, is a different and potentially more effective thing. What Dr. Wong represents in the larger theory of who Rick Sanchez is proof that some part of him has not given up. He could stop going. He has the financial and dimensional resources to avoid therapy forever if he wanted to. He keeps going back. And the fact that he keeps going back means that the part of him that wants to be okay, that has not entirely accepted that he cannot be reached or helped or changed, is still present and still making choices. Still showing up, still sitting down, still listening, even when listening is the hardest thing he has done that week. Section 9. The Rick Is Morty Theory. This theory is one of the most structurally audacious things the fan community has produced, and it has the unusual quality of being simultaneously very difficult to prove conclusively and very difficult to dismiss completely. It proposes something that sounds, on first encounter, like it could not possibly be serious. That Rick Sanchez is a grown-up version of Morty Smith. That the grandfather-grandson relationship at the center of the show is not what it appears to be. That the two of them are not simply family members who are very different from each other. They are the same person at different points in time, with the older version having arranged himself as a guardian and influence over the younger version, creating the cycle that produced him. The logic of the theory is assembled from several different types of evidence. Start with the physical resemblances, which the show has never tried very hard to conceal. Rick and Morty share a specific facial structure. They share hair that, when you account for aging, follows a natural progression from Morty's brown to Rick's white. They share a particular quality of facial expression and a particular pattern of emotional response that goes beyond what genetics alone would predict, even accounting for grandfather and grandson sharing some DNA. They both drool, in circumstances that connect to the megaseed theory, and most significantly, they share a brainwave pattern that Rick himself describes as uniquely complementary. Their brainwaves cancel each other out in a specific way that is useful for masking Rick's intelligence signature from detection. The show gives this a technical explanation in terms of portal gun physics, but fans have long noted that it would also make very precise biological sense if Rick and Morty were the same person at different points in developmental time. The loop that the theory proposes goes roughly like this. Morty grows up. The adventures with Rick shape him in ways that make him increasingly capable and increasingly independent. He develops his own facility with technology, his own tolerance for extreme circumstances, his own relationship with the multiverse. At some point, he loses someone he loves. In circumstances that mirror what happened to Rick, he spirals. He develops his own addiction. He becomes, in the way that the show has already suggested, Morty becoming more like Rick is a negative development, something closer to what Rick is now. He builds or independently develops his own portal gun. And then, decades later, he goes back. Not to prevent the tragedy. That kind of time travel is either impossible or inadvisable in the universe of the show, and Rick himself has demonstrated a principled resistance to timeline alteration, possibly because he knows where it leads. He goes back to be present, to be the grandfather that he did not have, to be the Rick in a young Morty's life, which means being Rick in his own young life, which creates the relationship that made him who he became, which sends him back to create that relationship. There is no origin point in this version of the story. There is only the loop, producing itself endlessly, each iteration creating the conditions for the next iteration. Rick is Morty grown old and worn down and rebuilt into something harder. Morty is Rick before the wear and the rebuilding. The relationship between them is not between two separate people. It is a single person looking at themselves across time, simultaneously trying to help and trying not to help so much that the version of themselves who needs to become Rick becomes something other than Rick. This loop, if it exists, would explain several things about Rick's behavior toward Morty that are otherwise slightly puzzling. His attachment to this specific Morty, as opposed to any other Morty from any other dimension. His tendency to allow Morty to develop in ways that involve growing pain rather than simply protecting Morty from every danger. His occasional moments of looking at Morty with an expression that reads less like a grandparent looking at a grandchild and more like someone looking at a reflection they have complicated feelings about. If Morty is who Rick used to be, then Rick helping Morty is Rick trying to help himself in a way that was not available to him the first time through. And Rick allowing Morty to get hurt, to accumulate trauma, to develop the particular edges that come from hard experience, might be Rick understanding that those edges are necessary, that the man he became required all of it. The most devastating implication of this theory is what it says about Rick's nihilism. If the loop is real, if Rick has been through this before and knows how it ends, then his apparent belief that nothing matters is not avoidance, and it is not philosophy. It is experiential knowledge. He has already lived Morty's entire story. He has already had the adventures and the losses and the relationships and the end of all of them. He knows that everything Morty is building right now will eventually be taken, or left behind, or transformed beyond recognition. He knows the cost. He knows the destination. And he keeps showing up anyway, keeps doing the whole thing again, keeps being Rick in Morty's life even though he knows exactly where Morty's life leads, because the alternative is not showing up. And not showing up is worse. The show has never confirmed this theory, but it has also never taken the deliberate steps that it easily could take to make it impossible. It leaves certain physical similarities unaddressed. It leaves certain elements of Rick's past vague in ways that the loop theory would resolve. It maintains what feels like a very specifically chosen set of gaps, and the theory fills those gaps with something that is emotionally coherent with everything else the show is saying about Rick. Section 10. What Rick actually wants. We have spent all of this time moving through theories. We have looked at the catchphrase and what it means in Birdperson's language. We have traced the origin story from Rick's choice to stay to the bomb that destroyed everything the stay was for. We have examined the question of whether he belongs in the dimension he now inhabits. We have sat with the possibility that his intelligence is maintained rather than natural, that he knows he is fictional, that his philosophy is armor rather than belief, that the curve he helped build is a monument to grief as much as to arrogance, that therapy is slowly reaching him, that the person across from him in his own life might be himself. All of it points toward the same central question, which is simpler than any of the theories that surround it. What does Rick Sanchez actually want? Not the performed answer, not the Szechuan sauce, which he names in the Season 3 premiere as his series motivation, with a level of absurdity that tells you exactly how little faith he has in the idea that his real motivation could be spoken aloud. The Szechuan sauce is the joke he hides inside when someone gets too close to the real answer. It is funny because it is ridiculous, and the ridiculousness is a wall, and the wall is something Rick builds everywhere he needs one. The real answer is not complicated. It is, in fact, extraordinarily ordinary for someone who is billed as the most extraordinary being in the universe. Rick wants what he had before Rick Prime dropped a bomb on it. He wants to come home to people who are his. He wants to sit at a breakfast table and have it mean something. He wants to love someone and have the universe leave that love alone. He wants the specific, quiet warmth of belonging to a family the way he belonged to his family before belonging was made impossible. This is not a secret the show hides very deeply. The show articulates it fairly directly in the moments when Rick's performance fails him, when the armor slips, and something true shows through. The very first episode of the show contains a moment that very few people remember because it is surrounded by so much more eventful material. Rick is at the breakfast table, Beth has made eggs, and Rick, before leaving the table, says something simple. He compliments the eggs. He mentions, briefly and without elaborating, that he wishes his wife could have been there to share them. He says it the way a person says something when they are not making a production of their sadness, when the sadness is just there the way it always is, sitting quietly underneath the ordinary morning activity of breakfast. It is easy to miss, easy to read as nothing, easy to dismiss as a throwaway line, but it is the first time the show tells you who Rick used to be. Before the portal gun and the nihilism and the drinking and all of the armor, he is a man who loved a woman and who misses her at breakfast. He is the person who, long ago, said no to infinity and yes to eggs and family and the completely non-extraordinary texture of an ordinary life with someone he loved. Everything that came after, all of the centuries of accumulated damage and distance and defensive performance, it all traces back to that table, to that person, to the specific, quiet, catastrophic loss of the thing he had chosen over everything else the universe had to offer. Inside the fear hole in the Season 7 finale, Rick is given a simulation of Diane. The fear hole is a place that works by materializing your deepest fears as immersive, constructed realities, keeping you inside them, using the things you cannot bear to lose against you. What Rick's fear hole gives him is not a monster or a threat or a cosmic danger, it gives him his wife. The Diane who appears in the fear hole is not real, and Rick knows she is not real, or comes to know it. The simulation is sophisticated, but Rick is very smart, and eventually the edges of the construction become visible to him. He knows. And he stays anyway. He keeps engaging with the simulation, keeps spending time with it, keeps choosing the constructed Diane over the real world, because the constructed Diane is the best possible version of something he cannot have in any other form. What keeps Rick in the fear hole is not failure of perception. He is not fooled. What keeps him there is desire so old and so deep that the knowledge of the simulation's falseness cannot override it. He wants to sit with her, even in a lie, even in a construction, because the shape of her presence, even manufactured, is something he has been without for so long that even a copy of it is better than nothing. This is the foundation of everything. Under the Central Finite Curve, which Rick helped build partly to protect Beth's, under the nihilism, which he performs to avoid feeling how much things matter, under the adventures, which keep him moving so that he cannot be still enough to feel the full weight of what he carries, under the therapy, which he keeps going back to because some part of him wants to find the way out. Under all of it, there is a man who misses breakfast, who misses the specific ordinary texture of a life that was enough, who misses the version of himself that existed before the bomb fell, the version that could be satisfied, the version that did not need infinity to feel like he was not missing something. The show has been building, through all of its seasons, toward the question of whether Rick Sanchez can ever arrive somewhere that feels like home. Not a restored version of what he had. That is gone, and Rick understands as well as anyone that the infinite multiverse does not contain the thing he specifically needs, which is not any Diane but his Diane in the universe where she was not erased, but whether he can build something in the family he has found, the one he arrived at sideways for complicated reasons that have become less complicated over time, that has the quality of a home rather than a temporary arrangement. The evidence, accumulated slowly across many seasons, suggests that he is moving in that direction. Not arriving, moving. The therapy continues. The relationship with Morty continues to mean something that Rick does not have language for, but demonstrates through action. The relationship with Beth carries the weight of all the grief he has never been able to process regarding the Beth he lost. And that weight is real, but it is also, increasingly, companionship. He is not the stranger in this house that he was when he arrived. He is not the family member that these people would be without if he left. Something has happened in these rooms that did not exist before he got here, and that something is his. He is in great pain, and in the only language of honesty available to him, the language of a man who loved him enough to learn it, he has been asking for help since the first episode. And the help has been coming, slowly, in the form of a family that has grown around him and through him and continues to require his presence, not because of his intelligence, not because of his portal gun or his inventions or his ability to solve any problem the multiverse can produce, because of him, because of whatever is underneath the performance. Because, in ways that the people around him are better at seeing than he is, Rick Sanchez is worth keeping. That is the theory underneath all the theories. That is the answer that every piece of evidence in the show is slowly, reluctantly, beautifully pointing toward. The smartest being in the universe is still figuring out how to be a person. And the fact that he is still trying is the most hopeful thing in the show. If any part of tonight gave you something to think about, or something to feel, or if it just kept you company through the quiet, dark hours while you drifted off, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Leave a like if it reached you. Subscribe if you want more nights like this, and take care of yourself out there. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody is going to die. Come watch TV. Peace among worlds. Number. Section 11. The mortality theory. Rick has died more times than we know. There is a theory that the fan community has approached from a few different angles over the years, and it never quite gets the sustained attention it deserves, possibly because it is uncomfortable in a specific way that the other theories are not. The other theories are about who Rick is. This one is about what happened to who Rick was. The theory is that the Rick we are watching in any given episode may not be the same Rick we were watching a few episodes ago. That Rick has died more times than the show has shown us. That Rick has been replaced by himself or by near copies of himself so many times that the question of continuity of identity has become genuinely unresolvable in his case. The show establishes early that Rick has the technology to transfer his consciousness. He can back himself up. He can clone himself. He has done both of these things on screen, in episodes that explore what it means to be multiple copies of the same person simultaneously. The episode with Tiny Rick is an early exploration of what it means to put Rick's mind into a younger body, and whether that younger body and the consciousness inside it are the same person in any meaningful sense. The answer the episode gives is complicated, which is the honest answer, but there are quieter and more pervasive implications to the backup and clone technology than the show generally explores in a single episode. If Rick can back himself up, and if Rick dies with some regularity, which the show establishes he does across multiple dimensions and timelines, then the Rick who gets backed up and restored is not the same physical entity that entered whatever situation killed him. He is a copy. He is the information of Rick Sanchez instantiated in new substrate. He remembers everything the previous Rick remembered. He has all the same patterns, all the same knowledge, all the same apparent personality. But the particular physical continuity that most people associate with being a continuous person over time has been broken. For most beings, this would be a shattering philosophical crisis. The question of whether the backed-up copy is really you, or whether the original died and the copy is simply a very good impersonation of you that has all your memories, is one of the most ancient and thorny problems in philosophy of mind. Rick C. 137 has had to resolve this question in practice, not in theory, probably many times. And the resolution he appears to have reached is a form of pragmatic acceptance that either does not involve caring much about the answer or involves having thought about it so deeply that he has arrived somewhere beyond the conventional. Distress about it. But here is where the theory becomes specifically interesting rather than just philosophically intriguing. Every time Rick is restored from a backup, he is restored to the state of that backup, which means whatever happened to him between the creation of the backup and the moment of death is potentially lost. If he had an experience that shifted something in him, a realization, a moment of genuine emotional progress, a connection that deepened in a way that he would not have anticipated before the moment, and if he dies before backing up after that experience, that version of the change is gone. The restored Rick is the Rick who did not yet have that experience. The progress does not carry forward. This possibility that Rick's emotional development might be periodically reset to whatever state his most recent backup captured explains something about the non-linear quality of his apparent growth across the series. He seems to advance and then retreat. He seems to understand things and then not understand them in later episodes. He makes connections and then appears not to have made them. Fans have attributed this to the inherent inconsistency of a long-running animated series, with multiple writers working across many seasons. And that is certainly a real factor. But it is also possible that within the fictional logic of the show, the resets are real. Rick is not the same Rick every episode. He is a series of Ricks, each one restored from the most recent backup of the last one who died, or was sufficiently damaged that restoration was necessary. The horror of this, the specific quality of suffering it implies, is the horror of someone who is trying to build something but keeps getting the tools reset. Rick makes progress in therapy. Rick allows Dr. Wong a little further in. Rick has a conversation with Morty that opens something and leaves something changed. And then an adventure goes wrong, and the Rick who emerges is backed up from 3 days ago, before any of it. The Dr. Wong progress is gone. The Morty conversation is gone. The small, hard-won shift in the direction of being okay is gone. Not for Morty and not for Dr. Wong, who still remember what happened and who still carry the changed version of their relationship with Rick. But for Rick himself, the record is gone. This would be an almost perfectly designed prison for someone who is trying to heal. It would mean that the most vulnerable and most important work Rick does, the work of allowing himself to be affected, of letting things through rather than building them out, is also the work most likely to be erased if the circumstances of his life do what they always do. And the armor, the nihilism and the distance, and the performed invincibility would be almost immune to this erasure. Those patterns are so deeply embedded, backed up so many times, that they survive every restoration intact. What gets lost is the new growth. What persists is the old defense. And yet the show, across enough seasons and enough episodes, does show cumulative change. Dr. Wong is a recurring presence. The relationship with Morty has demonstrably evolved from what it was in the first episode. Rick is not the same character he was in Season 1, even accounting for narrative inconsistency. Something has survived. Something has accumulated. Either Rick is backing up more carefully than he used to, capturing his emotional state alongside his cognitive one, or some of the changes have gotten deep enough into his patterns that even a restoration from an older backup contains them. Or the people around him who do not get reset are doing the work of restoring him to his current state, even when he comes back not quite knowing why things feel different than they should. That last possibility is the most quietly beautiful one. That Morty, who remembers every version of Rick that has come before the current one, is the continuity. That the accumulated relationship between them exists in Morty's memory even when it gets partially erased from Rick's. And that Rick, each time he comes back slightly behind where he was, is gently caught up by the people around him who know him and who hold the record of who he has been working to become. Number, Section 12. The quiet theory Rick chose this family. There is one more theory to sit with as tonight winds down, and it is the simplest one and possibly the most important one. It does not require multiverse physics, or complicated timeline structures, or questions about consciousness and identity. It requires only paying very close attention to something the show shows you over and over again without making a big production of it. Rick could leave. He has always been able to leave. He has a portal gun, he has a spaceship, he has access to infinite dimensions, infinite versions of every possible life, infinite opportunities to be elsewhere and be something different, and never look back. He left Beth once for decades and only came back when circumstances, and whatever he felt beneath the circumstances, drew him back. He has the tools, and the intelligence, and the freedom to make almost any choice he wants about where he is and who he is around. He chooses to be in the Smith family's house. Not because he has to be, not because there is no alternative, not because the family needs him in some practical sense that cannot be met another way, because Rick could engineer 100 different solutions to any practical problem that might keep him tethered to them. He stays because on some level, underneath every layer of performance and defense and claimed nihilism, this is where he wants to be. These are the people he has decided to be near. This family, assembled sideways out of grief and strategy, and the specific luck of a crash landing in someone's garage, has become the answer to the question of where Rick Sanchez goes when he has the whole multiverse to choose from. He goes home. He goes to breakfast. He complains about everything and cares about all of it. He performs indifference while demonstrating, in every actual decision he makes, that he is not indifferent. He says nothing matters while making himself indispensable to the people who matter to him. He claims to be using Morty as a sidekick while choosing, repeatedly, Morty's survival over his own convenience. He tells Beth she is more interesting than she thinks while building for her, in his clumsy, indirect way, the validation she has been waiting for her whole life. He tolerates Jerry in a way that, the longer you watch, starts to look less like tolerance and more like the affectionate exasperation of someone who has made a private peace with a person they initially thought they could not stand. He is not good at any of this. He is not graceful about it. He does not perform the emotional availability that a more transparent person would perform. He shows up in the wrong ways at the wrong times and says the wrong things, and then compensates for the wrong things with extravagant gestures that are themselves slightly off-key. He is trying, in the specific way that people who have never learned to try correctly still try, which is awkwardly and indirectly and with a lot of noise covering the signal. The theory is that this choosing, this staying, this showing up in wrong ways but still showing up is the real Rick Sanchez. Not the nihilism and not the genius and not the armor. The person who crashed into a garage and found himself a family and has been, ever since, doing the imperfect and insufficient and ongoing work of being someone that family can count on. The smarter he is, the more he understands about the universe, the more clearly he can see how fragile everything is, and how temporary and how fundamentally unguaranteed. And he stays anyway. He chooses this anyway. He is in the house and at the table and on the adventures and in Dr. Wong's office and making the choices that the nihilism would exempt him from making if the nihilism were real. That is the theory that all the other theories are pointing at. That underneath the catchphrase that means I am in pain, underneath the origin story that justifies every wall he has built, underneath the dimension hopping and the mega seeds and the constructed curve and the flask, there is someone who decided to care about a specific group of people in a specific house, on a specific planet, in a specific corner of an infinite multiverse. And that decision, small and unjustifiable by any philosophical framework Rick has ever articulated, is the most consequential thing he has ever done. He is in great pain. He has been in great pain for a very long time. And the pain is real, and the history behind it is real, and nothing that happens in future seasons of the show is going to make that not true. But he is also, and this is the part that takes all of the seasons to see clearly, someone who is still here, still in the house, still at the breakfast table, still saying things to Morty that are almost but not quite the things he means to say, still going back to therapy, still letting people in, incrementally, imperfectly, not without backsliding, and not without the familiar retreat into performance when the real thing gets to be too much. He is in great pain, and he is also, stubbornly, extraordinarily, entirely against his own best self-defense, still trying. That is the theory that matters most. That the most complicated character on television is complicated because he is trying to be something that does not come naturally to him, and that his history has done everything in its power to make impossible for him. He is trying to be a person who stays. He is trying to be a grandfather, which he never managed to be for his original family. He is trying to do the unglamorous, boring human work that Dr. Wong told him was necessary and that he ran from for decades. He is trying. And in a universe where nothing is guaranteed and everything is eventually lost, the trying is the whole of it. The trying is what makes him worth watching. The trying is what makes all these theories worth building. The trying is what makes it matter. What makes you stay up too late unpacking the layers of a cartoon scientist with a flask and a portal gun and a catchphrase that means something he cannot say directly. He is trying. And so, quietly, in their different ways, are we. Sleep well tonight. The multiverse will still be there in the morning. Number. Section 13. The Unity episode What Rick Looked Like When He Almost Let Someone In. There is one episode of Rick and Morty that the fan community consistently places near the top of their lists when discussing the show's most emotionally affecting moments, and it is also an episode that is essential to any complete theory about Rick Sanchez and what he actually wants. The episode is Autoerotic Assimilation from the second season, and it is an episode about Rick falling back into what can only be described as a love affair with a hive mind named Unity, and what that love affair reveals about why Rick is the way he is and what, specifically, he is so frightened of in the domain of intimacy. Unity is an entity that travels the universe, absorbing individuals into a collective consciousness, controlling entire populations through a kind of benign but total assimilation. Individual identity is subsumed. What remains is the hive, coordinated and purposeful and, by some metrics, peaceful. Rick and Unity have a history that predates the events of the show. They were involved before. They broke up, or separated, or the relationship reached some point of unsustainability that led to distance. And when Rick encounters Unity again in this episode, the old pull is immediately present. What Rick experiences with Unity is, in the context of everything we know about him, the closest thing to genuine intimacy that the show depicts him having with any being he meets during the course of the series. And what makes it intimate, specifically, is not the scale of Unity's capabilities or the novelty of her nature. It is the fact that Unity sees Rick, not the performance, not the armor, not the genius who needs to be the smartest in every room he enters. Unity has known Rick well enough and long enough to have a view of him that is not filtered through his defenses. She knows who he is underneath the version he shows everyone else. And she finds that version, the real version, interesting enough to return to even after the relationship had previously ended. The ending of the episode is the part that has generated the most theory and the most emotional discussion. Unity leaves. She sends Rick a note explaining why she cannot stay. She tells him, in the language of someone who genuinely knows what she is talking about, that Rick is so fundamentally destructive, so corrosive to everything around him, that continuing to be near him risks transforming her into something like him. She does not say this as an accusation. She says it as a fact that she has arrived at with what sounds like real sadness. She cares about Rick enough that leaving him is something that costs her something. But she also understands herself well enough to know that staying would cost more. And then Rick is alone, in his garage, after Unity's note, and the show gives us something rare, which is an extended, quiet, mostly wordless sequence of Rick in a moment of genuine devastation. He drinks, he tries to build something and cannot sustain the focus. He plays with the components. He sets himself up for a specific kind of ending, pointing a device at himself that would eliminate him, and then he passes out from the alcohol before he can use it. The show plays this in a specific register that is dark enough to be genuine and framed carefully enough that it does not tip into the territory of explicit depiction. But the intention is clear. Rick, alone in the garage with nothing left to perform for, was close to not being there anymore. The fan community has made a great deal of this moment for good reason. It is the show's clearest direct look at what exists underneath all of Rick's performance when the performance has nowhere to put itself. No audience, no mission, no adventure to generate forward momentum. Just Rick in his garage and the specific shape of the loss he has just incurred, which is not just the loss of Unity but the confirmation of something he already suspected, that he cannot have the things he wants. That wanting things and being who he is are in direct contradiction. That the version of him who is worthy of love is not the version that actually exists, or if it is buried so deep beneath the version that actually exists that the people who get close to it eventually have to choose between it and their own survival. Unity's assessment of Rick, that his presence is so fundamentally destabilizing that staying near him transforms everything around him into something that resembles him, is one of the most precise descriptions of Rick as a character that any being in the show ever articulates. She is not wrong. The show has been demonstrating this from the beginning. People who spend time in Rick's orbit become more like Rick. They develop his tolerance for danger, his willingness to sacrifice, his capacity for detachment, his complicated relationship with conventional morality. This is not always a good development. The show is very clear, in its treatment of Morty's evolution across the seasons, that becoming more like Rick is not the same as becoming better. It is becoming more capable of doing what Rick does, which includes the things Rick does that are genuinely harmful to himself and to everyone around him. The theory that the fan community built around this episode is essentially this. Rick knows that he is what Unity described. He knows that he is corrosive. He knows that the people who get close to him are changed by the proximity and not always changed well. And this knowledge, rather than motivating him to change or to reach towards something different, functions as confirmation of the nihilism he uses as armor. If his presence is fundamentally destabilizing, if loving him costs people too much, if the most honest thing anyone who cares about him can do is leave, then what is the argument for trying? What is the justification for the effort that Dr. Wong is asking him to make? The answer the show has been building toward, slowly and without making speeches about it, is that the argument is Morty and Beth, and Summer in her way, and even Jerry, though Rick would object strenuously to the inclusion. These people have been in proximity to Rick for years. They have been changed by that proximity, and not only for the worse. Morty is more capable. Beth is more honest with herself. Summer has pushed herself into circumstances that have grown her in genuine ways. The damage Rick does is real, but the damage is not the only thing he does. And the people who have stayed, who have absorbed the costs and kept choosing to be in the house, are their own argument against the theory that loving Rick only costs. He is corrosive, and he is also, in the specific and limited ways he knows how to be, generative. He is damaging, and he is also, in the indirect and imperfect ways that are all he has, loving. Unity saw both halves of this and could not find a way to live inside the tension of them. The Smith family has been living inside that tension for as long as the show has existed, and the fact that they keep living inside it, keep showing up to the breakfast table, keep going on the adventures, keep sitting in Dr. Wong's office, keep choosing to be his family even knowing all of what that means, is its own kind of evidence about what Rick is. He is not only what destroyed unity, he is also the person that a family, accidentally assembled out of grief and circumstance, decided was worth keeping. Number. Section 14. The long, slow argument. What the show has been saying all along. When you step back from any individual theory and look at the show across all of its seasons, across all the adventures and the revelations, and the emotional arcs that wind through years of episodes like rivers through difficult terrain, something becomes visible that is easy to miss when you are close to any single part of it. Rick and Morty is making a very long argument. Not about nihilism, though nihilism is in the argument. Not about science or the multiverse or the nature of intelligence, though all of those are part of the argument. The argument is simpler and older than any of those things. The argument is that being alive is worth it. Not because the universe is kind, not because things work out, not because suffering is temporary or love is permanent, or any of the comfortable things that people tell each other when the world gets hard. The universe in Rick and Morty is frequently cruel, casually indifferent, and structurally designed by the Ricks who built the Central Finite Curve to serve the interests of a very specific kind of person rather than anyone else. The multiverse is full of things that will kill you, full of bad deals and no-win scenarios and choices between options that are all wrong in different ways. The show has never pretended otherwise. And yet, here is Rick Sanchez, the smartest being in the universe, the one person whose intelligence should most clearly allow him to calculate that the costs outweigh the benefits. Here is Rick Sanchez choosing every morning to exist in a house with a family, to go to therapy, to be a grandfather, in the specific, awkward, failing way that he is a grandfather, to keep Morty alive through sheer force of will and invention across dozens of situations that should have ended differently, to sit with Beth in her difficult moments, to let Dr. Wong see him a little further each time, to use his flask and his portal gun and his extraordinary brain not ultimately for conquest or escape or the accumulation of power, but for the maintenance of a life that has people in it. The show is arguing, through Rick's behavior rather than Rick's words, that this is what intelligence is for, not for separating yourself from the world and the people in it, not for constructing elaborate philosophical frameworks that exempt you from the obligation of caring, not for building faster escape routes. Intelligence is for navigating the things that are worth being in, even when they are hard. Intelligence is for finding your way back to the table when you have been absent too long. Intelligence is for building things that serve people, rather than just serving the builder. Rick is not a good person. The show has never claimed he is. He has done things across its run that are genuinely harmful and sometimes genuinely monstrous, and the show does not look away from those things or excuse them. But he is a person who keeps trying to be better than what the worst parts of his history have made him. He is a person who returns to therapy, who stays in the house, who shows up for adventures he did not need to go on because Morty needed him there, who, when asked what he wants at the moments of his most honest communication, reveals that what he wants is not more power or more freedom or a bigger section of the multiverse cordoned off for his exclusive use. He wants breakfast. He wants someone next to him. He wants the ordinary texture of a life that is shared rather than solo. Every theory about Rick Sanchez is ultimately a theory about this, about the gap between the performance and the person, about the distance between what he says and what he does, about the layers of grief and armor and strategy and genuine care that have been accumulating around a very specific, very ordinary, very human desire for a long time. He wants to belong somewhere, He wants the people he loves to be safe. He wants the morning after the adventure to include eggs and conversation and someone next to him who he chose and who chose him back. He has been telling us this since the very first episode, in a language most people do not speak, in the phrase that sounds like celebration and means something else entirely, in every choice he makes that contradicts the philosophy he claims to live by, in the way he keeps coming back to a house that started as a choice made for complicated reasons and has become something that would now be genuinely devastating to leave. He is in great pain. Please help him. And the show, if you watch it carefully enough, suggests that help has been arriving. Slowly, imperfectly, not on any predictable schedule, but arriving. That is the theory. That is the one underneath all the others. That Rick Sanchez, for all his genius and all his damage and all the weight of everything that happened to him in Dimension C-137 when he was a younger and less defended man, is someone who is on his way back towards something. Not toward what he had. That is gone. But towards something. Something small and ordinary and fundamentally unkillable by portal gun or Omega device or any technology the multiverse has yet produced. He is on his way back toward home. And somewhere in the house, at the breakfast table, in the awkward silences of therapy sessions and the chaotic closeness of adventures that could have killed them both, the people who are his family are waiting for him to arrive. Number A. Note on falling asleep to this. It is worth saying something, at the very end of all of this, about why Rick Sanchez makes sense as a subject for this kind of late-night exploration. There are theories about a lot of shows and a lot of characters. There are deep dives into fictional worlds that reward close attention. But something specific happens when you spend a long time looking closely at Rick Sanchez, specifically at night, specifically when you are tired, and the world has gotten quiet around you, and the usual noise of the day has pulled back enough to make space for something more reflective. What happens is that the distance between Rick Sanchez and the person watching him starts to collapse a little. Not because most people have built portal guns, or defeated galactic federations, or turned themselves into pickles to avoid difficult conversations, but because the core of what Rick is running from, and the core of what he eventually runs toward, are not alien. They are deeply familiar. The fear that caring will cost you something. The desire to seem invulnerable when you are not. The complicated experience of loving people you did not plan to love in ways that you did not anticipate and cannot fully articulate. The stubborn, unjustifiable hope that it is still possible to build something worth staying for. These are not science fiction themes. These are the themes of being alive. And Rick and Morty, for all its interdimensional ambition and its genuine love of chaos and its commitment to being funnier and stranger than almost anything else on television, is ultimately a show about those themes. About people trying to do the work of being people in a universe that makes no particular promises about how that work will go. It is a good show to fall asleep to because it asks questions that do not have easy answers and then does not punish you for not having the answers. It creates a kind of productive wondering that is very different from the anxious problem-solving that keeps most people awake. You are not solving anything by thinking about Rick Sanchez. You are just thinking about things that are worth thinking about what people are underneath, what they perform, about what it costs to care and what it costs not to, about what home means when you have been very far from it for a very long time. And if somewhere in the middle of thinking about all of that you drift off, that is exactly right. The questions will still be there tomorrow. The multiverse will still be there tomorrow. And so, if tonight has been kind to you, will Rick Sanchez, back in the garage, building something, at home in the only way he currently knows how to be? Sleep well. You exist on purpose tonight. You belong right here. And everything is going to be okay, or at least it is going to be interesting, which in the world of Rick and Morty is usually the same thing. Peace among worlds. Number final thought. What we owe the characters we care about. There is something worth acknowledging in the act of spending this kind of time with a fictional character. When we theorize about Rick Sanchez, when we spend hours tracing the evidence of who he is and why and where he is going, we are doing something that goes beyond entertainment in the narrow sense. We are practicing the skill of paying close attention to someone. We are exercising the muscles of trying to understand a complicated person rather than dismissing them. We are working on the kind of patient, evidence-gathering, assumption-questioning attention that is very difficult to bring to real people in real life Partly because real people can push back, and partly because the stakes of misunderstanding a real person are higher than the stakes of misunderstanding a cartoon scientist. But the practice transfers. The habit of looking for what is underneath the performance, of noticing when the stated philosophy and the actual behavior are in conflict, of paying attention to what the small choices reveal, rather than only the large statements, that habit is useful anywhere you choose to apply it. The person across from you at the breakfast table might not be Rick Sanchez, but they might also have a catchphrase that means something in a language you have not yet learned. They might have armor that looks like something else. They might be choosing to be in the room with you for reasons that are more complicated and more real than the ones they could easily articulate. Rick and Morty makes you better at noticing that, if you let it. If you watch it the way we have been watching it tonight, with patience and with the willingness to sit with questions that do not resolve quickly. It is a show about the difficulty of being a person, made by people who are clearly interested in the difficulty of being a person, and watched by people who are daily confronted with exactly that difficulty in their own lives. That is, in the end, what makes it worth the theories. Not the portal gun physics or the multiverse architecture or the clever science fiction premises, though all of those are genuinely enjoyable. It is the fact that underneath all of those things, there is a man at a breakfast table who wishes someone he loved was still there to share it. And that man, for reasons the show has spent many seasons slowly building, is choosing to set another place at the table anyway. Choosing to let new people fill the space that old grief left behind. Choosing, imperfectly and reluctantly and with enormous resistance and enormous love, to still be here. That is the story worth telling. That is the theory worth building. And that is, on a quiet night when the world has gone still enough to hear it, the thing that is worth falling asleep thinking about.